Hi, everybody. I'm going to try and limit the amount of times that you're listening to my voice over lectures and streamline activities just a little bit. But on occasion, my sweet huggers, there's still stuff that is not in any textbook or any review guide or any other place but in my head. So on occasion, we're going to have to do some of these lectures, but I'm going to make them short and sweet, not like normal. And always with a meme, thank you, Dwight, for a little comic relief on this very strange first day of our new quarantine online learning schedule. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of put these both up here. So cities across the world, we're going to be talking about the two different learning targets that are linked to the week overview. So we're looking at cities across the world and cities and globalizations and so on and so forth. So just kind of talking about cities in general, there are two types of cities that exist out in the world that are of special note, and those are megacities and metacities, which metacities is brand new to this New York course articulation, but it's pretty simple. When we're talking about megacities or we're talking about mega cities, essentially these are just huge cities. Megacities have a population of over 10 million people, and metacities are very, very large and have a population of over 20 million people. They both have these similarities right here, as you can see. I think I'll use the pointer actually. So in both cases, megacities and metacities are more common in LDCs. I'm going to show you a map on the next slide so you can see this. They both provide economic opportunities. So as you can see, check it out, migration is back. So they are a pull factor for migrants in that whole rural to urban migration that we talked about in our second unit. But they are not necessarily world cities because they lack influence. So this is not going to make sense until I talk about world cities, but I will get to that at the end of this presentation. The other thing that is true about mega and meta cities is this idea of conurbation. And conurbation is, and I will talk about this on the next slide as well, is just extended urban areas where cities are kind of merging with the surrounding areas. And so it's just really challenging to tell the difference between where a city sort of begins and ends because it just kind of keeps growing. This term is actually going to come up more than one time. Okay, so let's take a look at this map really quickly. These are the world's megacities. Notice that there's not metacities, but you can kind of see that, for example, Mumbai would be considered a metacity because it's 20 million people or above, whereas Beijing would just be a megacity because it hasn't reached that 20 million people. So that's really the only difference between those two terms. But as you are looking at this map, it should become relatively apparent to you that most of the largest cities are happening in LDCs. This map doesn't actually show where the next big influx of giant cities is going to be, which is here in Africa. But that's what all the demographers are speculating right now, is that we're going to see some huge, huge cities here in Africa begin to develop. And this should make sense to you, because you know that in LDCs, that is where the population is growing the quickest. And so that is why you're seeing the most growth or the hugest cities developing in LDCs. There's some in MDCs. You can, New York makes the cut. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, those last two terms are pretty simple. It's just relating to the size of cities, but this is a little bit more important because now we're talking about cities and globalization. So you have urban hierarchy, and that's what we're dealing with for the rest of these slides. So urban hierarchy is this idea that you're ranking urban settlements by population size and also economic function. Okay, so in other words, the number of services that are provided in any particular city. Or AP, likes to muddy things up and make things more complicated. Another way to look at this is functional complexity. So how complex is the geographic space that we're looking at? Now, when you are ranking urban developments, you start from kind of in terms of classifications, you start from the smallest. So Hamlet is the smallest of the urban hierarchies, and you're going to see that, like, the title of this is urban hierarchy, and I'm starting off with rural, but you have to remember that we've been talking about this, and that is, like, most major cities started as rural areas that then developed characteristics over time that turned them more urban, because urban is a process. And so we still see evidence of all of these different areas present. So Hamlet is the smallest, so there's few services. And when I'm talking about services, I'm talking about like like a gas station or a convenience store or a library, or all of those things that you might see as an area becomes more populated. So there's few to no services, maybe a gas station, maybe one street light, maybe. Then you get to villages, and now we're seeing clustered human settlement. So there's going to be several services, not a ton yet, but several. So you might have a small grocery store, you might have a mechanic, you might have something that looks a little bit like Radiator Springs, actually, in our little video that we saw. Now you've got a town. So this is basically a larger village, and hopefully you can kind of see what I'm doing here. It's like small, a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger. So this is a larger village where they're going to have a larger village where they're going to have many goods and services. You also might hear people refer to towns as having outskirts, like, oh, they live on the outskirts of town, which means that they're, that just kind of relates to this idea of geographic size of this particular settlement. Then we get to cities. And so now we're talking like Chicago. So almost all cities have surrounding suburbs. This is where you're going to find the maximum amount of goods and services. I mean, think about the difference between, say, what you can find in St. Charles in terms of services and what you can find in Chicago in terms of services. Like, there might be a Toyota dealership here, but there's probably not going to be a Ferrari dealership here. There will, however, be a Ferrari dealership here. So you've got like and we'll talk more about this actually tomorrow, and why that, a city is going to have so many goods and services, many more restaurants, you're going to have schools, colleges, etc. You kind of get the picture. Now, a metropolis or a metropolitan area is an urbanized area where you have several interconnected cities and suburbs. And my favorite, and Mr. Biles fans too, the term megalopolis is a series of interconnected metropolises. You kind of get the point. So the best example of this is when you look at the East Coast and you have like the Eastern Corridor, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. If you were to look at a nighttime map, you would see this corridor of lights that sort of links those three places together. So it's really challenging to tell the difference between where, say, Boston ends and New York begins, or however you want to look at it. And here, again, a megalopolis is another example of conurbation, where you just see like the city is growing so much, it grows into the next city, and so on and so forth. Okay, so urban hierarchy continued, just to kind of give you an idea. We've actually already talked about this metropolitan statistical area, but this is where the census becomes really important, because it's the census, and remember, this is a census year, 2020, so we're going to get new data about who's moving in and out of suburbs, who's moving in and out of like the city, and services are sort of defined by the number of people who are living in a particular area. So you actually really need people to live in you need an accurate number of people who live in a particular area in order to determine things like school, like the amount of schools that you might need, and other services that you would potentially provide. So when we're talking about a metropolitan statistical area, you need to have a population of over 50,000 people. The census, the functional area of the city, say, would include the county where the city is located. So in our example right here, this is Cook County, so that's part of the metropolitan statistical area. And then the adjacent counties that the central city serves. So you probably are remembering this right now. So you've got Cook County, but then if you look at these like borders over here, this is the area that is essentially served by the city of Chicago, right? You get out here to like Dixon, and this is just too far. People from Dixon do not make a whole lot of drives into the city because it just becomes too much of a commute, right? So then you look down here, and like we have bits of Indiana as part of our metropolitan statistical area, whereas this area down here has bits of Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri. So you can kind of see that these are the areas that would constitute a metropolitan statistical area. And then, bringing back like are formal, functional, nodal regions. So when we're talking about an MSA, we're talking about the city itself being the node, and then all the surrounding areas as part of well, the nodal region. Okay, world cities. Couple last things. So what the heck is a world city? As I mentioned, not all megacities or metacities are world cities, but some are. What makes a city a world city is that it exerts influence far beyond national boundaries. So cities that are considered world cities or global cities have economic, political, and or cultural power of some kind. These are the top of the urban hierarchy. These are the cities that essentially drive globalization, that make all the decisions, that just, I mean, they're the things that sort of drive the global economy. Now, what's interesting is where, because just like site and situation we talked about before, site, remember, is what you see, but situation is, um, more to do with like where something is located in relation to something else, but also its connectivity and its accessibility. And so in the 1600s, world cities were London, Lisbon, and Amsterdam. Then by the 1700s, it's Rome and Paris. By the 1800s, Berlin, Chicago, New York City, St. Petersburg. And Chicago makes the list here because of we were going through the Industrial Revolution, and the world was watching us and what we were doing. And then by the 20th century, and you can look at world cities in terms of tiers as well. So like the most important cities today are New York, London, and Tokyo. And then you have this sort of secondary level of importance that include, as you see, LA, Brussels, Paris, Singapore, etc. And then there's a third tier as well. And I'll get a little bit more into those tiers in a minute. Okay, so here's what I like. So we just finished talking about the first tier, and then here's a map to demonstrate the same thing. So in terms of world cities, what you see over here, your dominant cities, these giant circles, and then you have your major cities, which would be like kind of the tier 2 cities, and then you've got your tier 3 cities, and you can just sort of take a look at the map. But what I really like about this map is how it compares to this map, right? This is like an example of a network. These are airlines, but like you can see how it almost appears that like all the things are going through New York, London, and Tokyo, right? Like here it's apparent just in the way that we look at airlines. So part of this learning target includes your understanding of how world cities create these sort of networks of connections. And again, with time-space compression, distance might be far here, but is it? Not really, not with transportation and communication technology. You're going to have a far, like, remember, time-space compression is this idea that you're shrinking time distance, not physical distance, right? Much, much less connection in Central Africa, much less connection with the rest of the world. In South America, actually much, much less connection with the whole world when you're looking at the Southern Hemisphere, with maybe the exception of, bits and pieces of Australia over here. Okay, so because scale matters, you can actually look at the idea of cities of prominence from the national scale as well. So if you look over here, you've got your dominant world cities. And then of course, New York is the only one that shows up, but then you've got all these secondary cities, and you've got this tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And when you're looking at this, these like functionality, like what this is, I mean, you don't actually have to know this, but it's this idea of functional specialization, which is over here. Like there are certain cities that are going to specialize in certain functions. And then the more significant or important the city is, the more functions it's going to serve. So you might have like an area that's just primarily manufacturing or mining or resource or retirement or whatever it might be. But in a dominant city, you're going to see evidence of all of those different functions and so on. Okay. So I know I went through that really quickly because I don't want to waste all your time just listening to me. I know you guys have a lot of stuff to do. So today, the way in which you're going to demonstrate your learning is you're going to compare and contrast. Obviously, you contrast. I shouldn't even put that because you guys know at this point to compare means also that you have to look at both of the things. Compare and contrast a world city with a mega or meta city. There's another question on Google Classroom that's posted. So all you got to do is answer those two questions and you're done for the day. And just a quick note, and I think I mentioned this before, but don't forget that starting tomorrow, we will have office hours. Mr. Baustein and I will both have office hours between 1 and 2 p.m., and we will send you a link for the Google Hangout or Meet, I guess is what we're doing. We'll send it to your email tomorrow at probably about 12:45, and then we'll start at 1 o'clock. So if you have any questions, we will be available to you every single day. And then you can see my face if you're my student. I think Mr. Beilstein's face is like Arnold Schwarzenegger from the Terminator. I don't know. He's so weird. Anyway, all right, you guys. If you have any questions, or if you need to go back and like pause the video to take notes, please do. Otherwise, this video is available to you whenever you want it. And now I have to figure out how to turn this off. Ah! What do I do? Ah, stop.